Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see y'all today. Let's see, let me get set up here. It's this one, right? No, not this one. All right, here we go. Great. Well, welcome to Access. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors here at this church. If you're visiting and you're a guest today, we are just so glad that you're here with us, and thanks for being here. I was thinking about this past week, and it feels like there's been a lot of emotions this past week, right? This weekend, I saw a lot of elation as the Horns, beat OU. I saw a lot of excitement about the Stros, as it looks like they're going to be contenders, and that's really exciting. But there was also, some hard things this week too, right? A lot of strong emotions at a national level around the confirmation of Judge Kavanaugh, right? Strong feelings on both sides, right, about the merits of that. And I've just been present to a lot of these emotional feelings, and for people who have been victims of sexual abuse and harassment, a lot of strong emotions and hurts there. Last Sunday we talked about the Giving Initiative, and I shared with you all about some of the financial challenges that our church is going through and going to be facing in the next couple years. And, there's emotions there. And so I've just been sitting with all these different things, and it hasn't been all, bad emotions. There's been good things, too. One thing that really encouraged me is that, last Sunday, after the launch of our Giving Initiative, a youth made a pledge, right? We had our first pledge from a youth for next year, and that was really, really encouraging to me. So as I've been sitting with all these emotions, there's been all these things happening, important things. It could feel like a lot, and it made me very grateful for the time that we get to have on Sundays. Particularly on this first Sunday of the month, we will be taking communion together as a church. And I thought, what better way to kind of just take a time out, kind of just take a pause from all that's happening, just the busyness, the intensity of our lives, and to step back and ask God, where are you in the midst of it all? What are you trying to say? What are you doing? And just to rest in God's presence. And that's why we gather here on Sundays. That's why this time is so important. It's a time for the community of God to gather together, to just receive from God, to encourage one another so that we can go out into the world and live kind of according to his ways and share those ways, an alternative way with the world. So, as a community, we have been journeying through this series on Jacob. And I have to admit, when Ted first mentioned that we were going to be doing this series, I didn't think much about it. But as we've been listening to the stories of Jacob, I found it to be extremely fascinating and extremely relevant. Jacob's context is so different than our own. And yet, I think maybe you've seen this too if you've been with us, that the themes that Jacob experienced are timeless, right? Themes about family, themes of loyalty and betrayal, deceit, forgiveness, identity, confusion, redemption. These are all themes that all of us can relate to. And so the idea of this series is that we look at the stories of old, because in these stories we find a window into where we come from and who we are today. It reminded me of the fact that in seminary I had a chance to do a genealogy project. And so in this project I had to interview my parents and ask them questions about our past and our heritage that normally wouldn't come up in normal conversation. And one of the most fascinating things I learned through this conversation with my dad is that my great-grandfather on my paternal side, he is of unknown origin, in that the word on the street is that he was Dutch or maybe German. And so when I heard that, I was like, oh, okay, that explains why I like Heineken's. In moderation, of course, right? But, as we were talking and they were sharing with me about the journey of their parents and their parents' parents and the dysfunctions that were there, right? The alliances, the broken relationships, the cutoffs, I was like, all of a sudden, like a light bulb like went off. Like all these dots started to connect because I could start to see, oh, that's why we're like that. That's why we have these patterns and behaviors. And it just started to make my life make a lot more sense because I could see the context from which we came. And so as we look at Jacob's story one last time today, my hope is that some dots will be connected for you, for all of us. As we look at some of the themes and some of the events and moments in his story, as we bring this to a conclusion, that we'll start to say, oh yeah, I get it. That's kind of like my life. Those markers are similar to my journey and my relationship with God. So let's pray together. I think just in light of all that's happening, I just feel like we really want to invite God into this space to speak to us and help us to hear him and be aware of his presence. So if you would join me in prayer. Gracious God, thank you for being here with us this morning. Thank you for being with us this whole past week. There's been a lot of stuff happening, a lot of stuff that weighs on my mind and my heart, and I need this time with our community. And so I would like to ask you to, in your grace, help us to become aware that you are here with us. Help us to be aware of what this world, our lives, and our journey with you. Thank you, God, that you are not a God who is far, but a God who is near. You are near to Jacob, and help us to see what his story might have to say to us this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we're going to start in Genesis chapter 32 today. All right, okay, so in Genesis chapter 32, what's happening is that Jacob is on his way home, and he's going to meet Esau. He knows he's going to meet his brother Esau. So if you've been with us here the last several weeks, you know that this isn't just an ordinary meetup of two brothers. So it's not like when I go to Los Angeles to visit my brother Paul, and I call him up on the phone and be like, hey, Paul, let's get together for lunch, and we chat together. Even though there was a time when my brother wanted to seriously hurt me with batteries, we have put that incident behind us. We put all of our beefs behind us, and we're cool now. I love my brother, he loves me, we are cool with each other. Jacob and Esau were not cool with each other at all. So it has been 20 years, right? If you read the whole narrative, you'll find that it's now been 20 years since they had last seen each other or spoken. And the last time that they were together, things had not gone well at all. So Esau and Jacob are twin brothers. Esau was the older twin brother, an outdoorsman who was loved and favored by his father Isaac. Jacob, on the other hand, was the younger brother. He was an indoors guy, and he was favored by his mother, Rebekah. By this time in the story, what you need to know is that Jacob has already swindled Esau out of his birthright over a bowl of soup. Remember the red stuff that we had talked about several weeks ago. And then in a very dramatic betrayal, Jacob and his mother Rebekah conspire to steal the blessing which Isaac means to give to Esau. So now, twice cheated, Esau is pushed to the limit, and he vows to murder his brother Jacob. He says, once my father dies, I am going to kill you. That's how livid and angry he is. And so like a fugitive, Jacob is forced to leave in the middle of the night to go flee to his uncle Laban, far, far away, and never to look back. And at this point then, the brothers have become totally alienated from one another. So when we get to chapter 32, it's now been 20 years since this incident happened. 20 years since they've seen each other. It's 20 years since Jacob had left home. And by this time now, Jacob has forged a life for himself. He's married to Leah and Rachel. By this time, he has 11 sons and a daughter. And he's pretty successful by ancient standards. He has many herds of animals, and he has done well for himself. But God has appeared to him and instructed Jacob to go back home. And Jacob is utterly terrified. You know, we have like friends that, the kind of friends that sometimes you can just kind of leave. You cannot see them for a long time and you can just kind of pick up where you left off, right? We all have some of those friends, right? Jacob is afraid of that. He's afraid that this whole time, Esau has been just ruminating over the way his dirty brother swindled him. That he's been sitting there like sharpening his knife for like 20 years, just waiting to exact sweet revenge. And so Jacob is really afraid. He's really afraid. What's Esau going to do to me and to my family now? So, Genesis chapter 32. Jacob also went on his way, and the angels of God met him. When Jacob saw them, he said, "This is the camp of God." So he named that place Mahanaim. Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. He instructed them, "This is what you are to say to my lord Esau. Your servant Jacob says, I have been staying with Laban and have remained there till now. I have cattle and donkeys, sheep and goats, male and female servants. Now I am sending this message to my lord that I may find favor in your eyes." So Jacob is trying to put like a feeler out there. He can't just text Esau and be like, "Hey, we cool now?" He can't do that. So he's trying to just get a sense of where things are at with his brother. And this is the response. When the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, "We went to your brother Esau, and now he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." In great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into two groups, and the flocks and herds and camels as well. He thought, if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that is left may escape. Needless to say, this is not the reaction that Jacob is hoping for from Esau. But Jacob, always quick on his feet, right, comes up with a plan. He divides his family and his possessions into two, and what he's thinking is, I'm going to try to minimize my losses, all right? And then he turns to God. Jacob says this, "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, 'Go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper.' I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become two camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted." Jacob's prayer in this chapter, it refers back to the first defining spiritual experience of his life. So if you were here with us several weeks ago, you know that what Pastor Ted talked about is once Jacob left home, he was on his way. He's going by foot to his uncle Laban's house. He doesn't know where he's going. And just in complete and utter destitution, he just lays down. He goes to sleep with a rock next to his head, with a rock for a pillow. It's like the lowest point of his life. Everything he's tried to scheme and manipulate for and try to get by his own strength, it's just completely fruitless. It's all blown apart. And in this moment of desperation, he lays down, and for maybe the first time in his journey with the divine, God speaks to him in a very unmistakable way. God gives him a promise. And this prayer that he prays in chapter 32, it refers back to this promise that he gets in this moment of just brokenness. And here's the promise. God says to him, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. So he's lying there thinking, my life is just destroyed. And God says, this land, I'm going to give it back to you. I'm going to do something in you and through you. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have promised, and until I have done what I have promised to you. So at this point, Jacob only has a staff. That's all he has with him. And he has this promise from God. For 20 years, I think this is the promise that Jacob clung onto with every single fiber of his being, because he had nothing else. When nothing made sense, he remembered that God had promised to be with him. When he was swindled by his uncle Laban, he remembered that God would bless him. And when he was out in the field alone with his thoughts, he remembered that God has a plan for me. And so now, as before, right, Jacob clings to this promise. God, save me, fulfill your promise to me. And then Jacob executes the second part of his plan. So he spent the night there, and from what he had with him, he selected a gift for his brother Esau: 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 female camels with their young, 40 cows and 10 bulls, and 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. He put them in the care of his servants, each herd by itself, and said to his servants, "Go ahead of me and keep some space between the herds." He instructed them, the one in the lead, "When my brother Esau meets you and asks, 'Who do you belong to and where are you going? And who owns all these animals in front of you?' then you are to say, 'They belong to your servant Jacob. They are a gift sent to my lord Esau, and he is coming behind us.'" He also instructed the second, the third, and all the others who followed the herds, "You are to say the same thing to Esau when you meet him, and be sure to say, 'Your servant Jacob is coming behind us.' For he thought, 'I will pacify him with these gifts I am sending on ahead. Later, when I see him, perhaps he will receive me.' So Jacob's gifts went on ahead of him, but he himself spent the night in the camp." So Jacob's plan is like, I'm just going to gift my brother with a zoo, and hopefully it'll just all work out, right? Well, so again, Jacob's like strategizing. He's like, all right, I'm going to split these animals into herds, and I'm just going to wear down my brother with gifts. I'm not totally sure, but I think Jacob learned this tactic from his kids. So my kids can be really tenacious about asking for something. And initially I'll be like, no. But then they just keep asking again and again and again. And eventually I'm like, okay, fine, just whatever, just do it, right? I just give in because of the tenacity and their persistence of asking. And so I think Jacob's just thinking, maybe by the time the donkeys get to him, Esau will decide not to kill me, okay? So it would be easy to look at this and think, oh, gosh, it doesn't seem like Jacob has changed very much. He's still scheming, still coming up with all these strategies and stuff like that. And while that's true, what happens next shows us that, yeah, there are parts of Jacob that are still the same, but there are also parts of him that have significantly changed. Isn't that true for most of us, right? We're kind of like the same, but then we're also different, and that's just a tension that we see in our lives. So that night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him, and as he passed Peniel, he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. So this is a very interesting interchange. Everything in Jacob's life has kind of led up to this moment. Esau is en route with 400 men. Jacob doesn't know if Esau's intention is to kill him and his entire family, or if he has some other intentions. And Jacob, I think he is weighed down with this knowledge that in this upcoming moment, both everything in his past and everything in his future is going to kind of converge in this one moment. This is kind of like do or die for him. And that's when Jacob wrestles with a mysterious figure. So some commentators say this mysterious figure is an angel, right, and a messenger of God. Others would say that it's a theophany, right? A theophany is a special manifestation of God in human form. And there are several examples of theophanies throughout the Old Testament. Full disclosure, I have never experienced a theophany yet, but that's why this series is called Jacob and not John, right? Jacob, I think, meets with God in human form, and it's this incredible experience. And so once again, Jacob has this incredible encounter with God, and the parallels to his earlier life are unmistakable. And this would be the second life-changing experience he has with God. So years before, right, Jacob had struggled to find favor with his father. Jacob was invisible to his father. So he deceived his father and he cheated his brother in order to steal his father's blessing. But now this time, Jacob wrestles with God face to face. There's no deception. There's no hiding. There's no manipulating. There's no covering. There's no cheating. It's eye to eye and face to face. And only now, what Jacob finally understands is that what he needs most is not his father's blessing, but God's. That's the journey that Jacob has gone on. He finally understands what I need most in my life is not my father's blessing, not my father's approval, but God's blessing. And to mark the giving of this blessing, the man changes Jacob's name to Israel. Israel means wrestles with God. And so now Jacob, armed with this new identity, is ready to meet his brother. Jacob looked up, and there was Esau, coming with his 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 female servants. He put the female servants and their children in front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph in the rear. He himself went on ahead, and he bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. We don't know at what point Esau has forgiven Jacob. We don't know if Jacob's plans made any difference. But what we do know is that these 2 alienated brothers are now reconciled to each other. And this is what I would say is the third defining spiritual experience of Jacob's life. It stands out from the first 2 because in this instant, God doesn't directly address Jacob. He doesn't directly speak to him as in the first 2 experiences. And yet, I would argue that God is no less present in this experience. Because as these 2 brothers embrace again for the first time, God is there. God is there. As their enmity, as their anger, as their unforgiveness, as that gives way to forgiveness, as that gives way to compassion and finally peace, that moment is God's kingdom coming on earth as it is in heaven. That's why Jacob will say to his brother, "For to see your face is like seeing the very face of God, now that you have received me favorably." When we are received by others in relationship, that relationship becomes a conduit. It becomes a visible sign of God's invisible grace. That relationship becomes a sacrament. And when enemies reconcile, when enemies receive each other, man, that grace becomes turbocharged. It becomes overflowing. So Jacob's story is marked by at least 3 pivotal, life-changing experiences. Each experience defines him in a unique way, and each experience is very distinct and different from each other. So in the first experience, God gives Jacob a promise that will serve as his North Star for the rest of his life. But did you notice how it didn't come to Jacob at a time when he was doing great in life? It came to him at a time in spite of who he had become and what he had done. God shows up to Jacob when Jacob is at literally the end of his rope, at the end of himself. He is a broken man, but in his brokenness, he is now open to the things of God. In the second experience, God gives Jacob a blessing, but this interaction is very different from the first. In the first interaction, Jacob is just a broken man. He has no more fight left in him. But in this instant, Jacob's wrestling with God. He puts up a fight and he won't let go of God until God blesses him fully. Right? That's so interesting. This encounter is intense, and Jacob refuses to let go until he gets what he truly needs, God's blessing. At the end of it, God will give to Jacob a new name and a new identity. And he will also give him a new physical characteristic. He will limp for the rest of his life. And what I thought about from this experience, Jacob will emerge from this encounter with God a deeper, more whole man whose confidence is rooted in God, and yet he also walks with a limp. He has this visible sign of weakness. And it makes me think about how Christian maturity isn't like the elimination of weakness. It's where we find greater confidence in who God is and who God has made us to be, and yet we also humbly acknowledge our weaknesses, and we hold those things together. In the third experience, God gives Jacob his brother back. God gives him peace. You know, not just like a superficial, oh yeah, everything's fine kind of peace, but a peace that is hard won and hard fought. The peace that I think he had been longing for in his family his entire life. And as Jacob embraces his brother, once bitter rivals and enemies now become reconciled and restored. And in that relationship with his brother, the grace of God becomes tangible to Jacob. It's no wonder, I don't know if you caught this, it's no wonder that centuries later, when Jesus teaches the story, one of his most famous stories about the prodigal son, he'll say that the father, when he sees his prodigal son returning, what does he do? The father runs to his son, puts his arms around him, and kisses him. For Jesus knew this story encapsulates the grace of God. 3 experiences, but there's actually a fourth one. This fourth one isn't as obvious. It's certainly not as glamorous, but it's probably more characteristic of our spiritual lives. It's the spiritual experience of waiting. Because you see, God gave Jacob a promise. And then he gives him a blessing and a new identity and a new name. But in between those 2 events, there's 20 years of waiting. 20 years, that's a long time. And Jacob doesn't know how or when or where God's going to fulfill this promise. He just knows that this is what God has said. I'm going to believe it. I'm going to hang on to it. I'm just going to wait. But waiting is not the same thing as doing nothing. Because during this time, Jacob works. He gets married twice. He raises a family, right? He is doing stuff. And during this time, this is a crucible in which God is forming his character and who he is. Waiting becomes an essential part of the Christian experience because it's in that time that God molds and shapes our character and our being so that when the time is right, we have the character, we have the competence that is able to fulfill the promise. So this is a snapshot of Jacob's story. Now fast forward to today, several millennia later, and I was thinking about Jacob's story. I'm like, these are like the same experiences I've gone through. Maybe not as dramatic, but they have so many, and these are the same experiences that we go through. As we live our lives, as we journey with God, as we try to figure what this life is all about, there are moments when we come to the end of ourselves. I see this all the time, right? For many people, their openness to God, it's like a direct function of how well their life is going, right? When they're at the top of the game, when they're successful in their career, when they have great friends or relationships going well, it's like, sure, God, maybe, I don't know, I just don't think about it. It's just not on my radar. Why would I even need God? The need is not there to even question or be open. But how many times I've seen when all of a sudden that relationship that I cherish slips from my fingers. Or when that job I thought that I just built my identity around just kind of goes away. When things start to go south, when the things that we were building our whole life start to vanish from ourselves and we realize that, man, I'm actually not in control, often that's when we are most receptive, when nothing else is working. And we finally realize that we don't have the power to save ourselves. That's when many of us become open to the promises and to this gift of love, because all of a sudden we realize, yeah, what else do I have? Maybe I will consider it. Maybe I will give it a shot. There are times in our journeys when we must wrestle with God. And this looks really different from that first experience, right? Wrestling with God is like you're fully engaged. You're crying out to God. You're desperate to God. You're letting God know, like, God, why are you doing this? You're engaged and you're fighting with God. Not fighting out of this disbelief, but fighting because you've seen that He is the one that you need. That God is the source of, the answers to life, and you need it from God. And so you won't let go until God gives you what you need, right? That's a very different type of energy. And I don't think we can sustain that kind of wrestling our whole life, right? We'd have limps. We wouldn't be able to walk. It'd just be too exhausting. But there are times when we have to fight. We have to fight in our relationship with God to get to that next level. And that's what Jacob shows us. There are also times when we encounter God through the messiness of relationships. Man, I think this is really significant because, it's not unique to our community, right? But I'm very present to different conflicts and different things within our community that can really bring division and really hurt the church. And when we talk about life with God and community, what we're saying is that our relationship with man, it affects how you interact with one another. And I say this to myself because it's easy just to compartmentalize and like, this is what I do on Sunday. I worship. I have this belief system. But then the way I treat my brother or sister, it's like whatever. No, that can't be it. Because it is intertwined. They are intertwined. And so spirituality, our walk with God, isn't just this like ethereal pie in the sky thing. It is here and now. It is in the way I hold on to you. It is in the way that I deal with conflict. It is in the way that we work through our stuff. Because this is the very body of Christ, for whom Christ died, right? And so this story shows us that, gosh, when people can lay down their hatchets and come to each other and say, I really wronged you. Will you forgive me? That in those acts of humility, God's presence just totally shows up. God is there, even maybe more so than when we're singing songs or listening to word preached. When we actually go out and seek reconciliation, those become places. That becomes like a temple for the Spirit of God to work powerfully. And then there are times of waiting. I don't know anyone who likes waiting. I hate waiting. And yet waiting is where most of us will spend the majority of our lives. But remember that waiting isn't doing nothing. It is about allowing God to work in us, to produce a more deep-seated character, to change our values, not just our behavior or what we say, but to really change us from the inside out. And so these are some of the experiences. This isn't exhaustive, but these are some of the experiences that I've seen in my own life, that I've seen in your life, as we've shared. And my question is, where do you see yourself this morning? Where is God inviting you? How is God wanting to be present to you? I mentioned that on the first of the month we take communion. One of our rhythms as a community is take communion together. And so in these elements, we remember that we are not spiritual orphans, but we come from a long line of God's people that trace our lineage all the way back to a man named Jacob, who wrestled with God and was reconciled to his brother. In communion, we give thanks to God for Jesus. Because of what he has done on the cross and through his resurrection, he has opened the door for all of us to have spiritual experiences with God. God doesn't owe this to us. He doesn't owe that. He doesn't owe it to give us promises or to meet us in reconciled relationship. This is a gift. This is the gift that God willingly and wants to bestow upon all of us. And so this journey with God is made possible by what these elements symbolize. And so we give thanks to God for that. And in communion, we pause to take inventory of our lives, to recognize God's presence, that he is all around us, that God is always around us, inviting us, literally wooing us back to himself. And so is God inviting you into a season of waiting? Is he inviting you into a season of waiting? Maybe God is inviting you into a season or into some action to step into the ring of a messy relationship to seek reconciliation, because that's where he is. Is God inviting you to wrestle with him, to literally get off your butt and just to fight with God and to fight for what you need from God? Is God perhaps inviting you to receive a promise from him, a promise of new life, new hope, because everything else you've tried has been exhausted? So let's say these words together as we prepare to take the elements. For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus